They never told you this. If you're between 75 and 85 and you're still doing certain everyday things most people your age have quietly given up on, you are not just lucky. You are, statistically, part of a genuinely rare group. And what you're doing right may explain more about your health than any medication in your cabinet. I'm Dr. James Carter, and after more than 2 decades working with older adults, I've come to believe we've been telling people over 75 the wrong story about their own bodies that decline. Past this point is simply automatic, uniform, and out of your hands. It isn't. And today, I want to show you exactly what separates the seniors who are still thriving at 80 from those who aren't. Here's a number that should reframe how you think about this decade of life entirely. Research tracking functional independence in adults over 75 has found that fewer than 1 in 5 maintain the full range of daily physical and cognitive capabilities they had at 65 without significant decline, fewer than 20%. That means if you're still doing several of the things I'm about to describe, you're not average for your age group, you're in a genuine minority. And understanding why matters enormously, both for you and for anyone you love who's approaching this same decade. And here's the one I want to tease right now because I think it'll surprise you the most. It's not about exercise, and it's not about diet. It's item number 2 on today's list, and it involves something most people over 75 have quietly stopped doing years earlier without even registering the decision, something that, according to researchers studying healthy aging, correlates more strongly with maintained independence at this age than almost anything else on this list. I'll explain exactly what it is and why it matters so much when we get there. So stay with me. Before we dive in, I want to ask you directly, because I read every single comment on this channel, every single day. Tell me, how old are you right now? And is there one specific thing you used to do easily that you're determined not to give up, no matter what? I read every comment, and it genuinely shapes what I cover in future videos, so please don't hold back. All right, let's count it down together. 6 to 1, from impressive to truly remarkable. Number 6, you still get down onto the floor and back up again, without needing to think twice about it. Let me tell you about Harold, 78, from a small town outside Des Moines, Iowa. Harold came into my office not because of any complaint, but because his grandson had shown him a video online claiming that the ability to sit down on the floor and stand back up unassisted was one of the strongest predictors of longevity in older adults. Harold, half joking, wanted to know if it was true. I told him it wasn't a joke at all. It's one of the more fascinating findings in aging research over the past several years. Studies assessing what's sometimes called the sitting-rising test in older adults have found that the ability to move from standing to sitting on the floor and back up again, with minimal or no use of hands for support, correlates strongly with lower mortality risk and better overall physical function years later. This isn't magic. It's a real-time snapshot of several systems working together simultaneously. Leg strength, core stability, balance, flexibility, and even a bit of raw coordination and confidence. Here's why this matters so specifically after 75. Aging bodies lose muscle mass progressively, a process called sarcopenia, but the muscle groups involved in getting up from the floor, your quadriceps, your glutes, your hip flexors, and your core, tend to weaken disproportionately because they're rarely challenged through their full range of motion in typical daily activities like walking or sitting in chairs. Think of these muscles like a set of tools in a toolbox that you own but almost never open. They're still there, technically, but neglect leaves them stiff, weak, and slow to respond exactly when you need them most, like catching yourself during a stumble. If you can already do this comfortably, that's a genuinely encouraging sign, and I want you to maintain it deliberately rather than taking it for granted. Practice lowering yourself to the floor and standing back up 2 to 3 times, once or twice weekly, using a nearby chair or countertop for light support if needed, never pushing to the point of strain or risk. If you can't currently do this safely, please don't attempt it alone for the first time. Work with a physical therapist to build toward it gradually and safely. For synergy, pair this practice with basic hip and ankle flexibility stretches beforehand, since tight hips and ankles are often the limiting factor preventing a smooth transition to and from the floor, even in people with adequate strength. Number 5, you still cook your own meals from real ingredients rather than relying primarily on prepared or processed food. Eleanor, 81, from a suburb of Sacramento, California, still makes her own soups, roasts her own vegetables, and bakes her own bread most weeks, something her physician actually flagged during a routine visit as unusually consistent for someone her age. When I asked her about it, she simply said cooking had always been how she thought, and she'd never really stopped, even after her husband passed and her portions naturally became smaller. Research on dietary patterns in older adults has consistently found that those who prepare meals from whole ingredients tend to have meaningfully better nutrient intake, including higher levels of key vitamins, minerals, and protein, compared to those who rely primarily on heavily processed or prepackaged meals, which are often engineered for shelf life and palatability rather than nutritional density. This matters enormously for a body over 75 because of something called anabolic resistance. Think of it like a delivery truck that used to unload building materials efficiently at a construction site every day. In an older body, that same delivery truck shows up, but the construction site barely responds unless a larger, more concentrated, higher quality shipment arrives. Processed foods often deliver plenty of calories, but a comparatively thin shipment of the actual protein and micronutrients your muscles and immune system need to keep rebuilding effectively. Additionally, cooking itself involves a surprising amount of standing, reaching, chopping, and stirring, low-grade physical activity that adds up meaningfully across a day, along with the cognitive engagement of planning, sequencing, and adjusting a recipe, which appears to offer some protective benefit against cognitive decline, according to researchers studying everyday cognitive engagement in older populations. If you're still cooking regularly, I want to encourage you to keep it up deliberately, perhaps even expanding your repertoire slightly to keep it mentally engaging rather than falling into the same 3 meals on repeat. Aim to include a concentrated protein source, roughly 25 to 30 grams, at your main meal of the day, since this appears most effective for triggering muscle maintenance in an aging body. If you've drifted away from cooking, even reintroducing one homemade meal a few times weekly can meaningfully shift your nutrient intake. For synergy, pair your cooking routine with grocery shopping in person rather than exclusively through delivery services, since the walking, carrying, and decision-making involved in shopping adds another layer of physical and cognitive benefit to the same underlying habit. Number 4, you still maintain friendships you have to actively work to keep, rather than relying only on family. Vincent, 76, from a small community outside Phoenix, Arizona, has kept the same weekly card game running with 3 other men for over 20 years, even after 2 of the original members passed away and were replaced by newer friends. Vincent told me plainly that he considers this appointment as important as any doctor's visit, and after seeing his lab results and cognitive assessments compared to peers his age, I have to agree with him. Research on social connection and aging has found that older adults who maintain active friendships outside of their immediate family, relationships that require some ongoing effort to sustain, tend to show lower levels of chronic inflammation and better preserved cognitive function compared to those whose social world has narrowed primarily to family members alone. Researchers sometimes describe elevated, persistent, low-grade inflammation in aging bodies using the term inflammaging, a slow accumulation of inflammatory activity that, left unchecked, contributes to heart disease, cognitive decline, and slower recovery from illness or injury. Here's why friendships specifically, beyond family relationships, seem to matter so much. Friendships require active initiation, and the ongoing effort to arrange, maintain, and adapt these relationships appears to keep certain cognitive and emotional muscles engaged in a way that comfortable, obligation-based family relationships sometimes don't. Family relationships are wonderful, but they largely persist regardless of effort. Friendships tend to fade without deliberate maintenance, and the seniors who keep investing in them appear to be exercising something valuable in the process. If you still have active friendships requiring some effort, protect that time fiercely and consider it non-negotiable, scheduled the same way you'd schedule a medical appointment. If your friendships have quietly faded over recent years, and I know this becomes genuinely harder after 75 as more friends pass away or become less mobile, consider seeking out new connections through community centers, religious organizations, or hobby groups, since research suggests it's genuinely possible to build meaningful new friendships even later in life. Pair social time with light physical activity whenever possible, a walk with a friend rather than simply sitting, since combining these two habits appears to compound the anti-inflammatory and cognitive benefits of each individually. Now, before we move into the final three, the ones I genuinely believe matter most on today's list, if you're finding this valuable, please take just a moment to hit subscribe and tap the like button. It genuinely helps this information reach more people in this age group who need to hear it, and it costs you absolutely nothing. Thank you to everyone who does this consistently. Now, back to the countdown. Number 3. You still challenge your balance on purpose, rather than only moving cautiously on flat, predictable surfaces. Dorothy, 83, from a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, still tends a small garden with genuinely uneven ground, still occasionally steps over a low curb rather than walking around it, and still practices standing on one leg while brushing her teeth each morning, a habit her physical therapist taught her nearly a decade ago that she simply never stopped doing. Balance isn't a single skill. It's your brain constantly integrating 3 separate streams of information in real time: what your eyes see, what your inner ear senses about your head's position and movement, and what your feet feel on the ground beneath you, something called proprioception. Research on fall prevention in older adults has repeatedly found that deliberately challenging your balance system through varied, mildly unpredictable movement produces meaningfully better balance reflexes than walking exclusively on flat, predictable surfaces, which allows your brain to essentially go on autopilot without ever practicing quick correction. Here's why this matters so specifically after 75. The speed at which your brain integrates these 3 streams of information and issues a correction, sometimes called postural reflex speed, tends to slow with age, particularly if it isn't actively challenged and practiced. Think of it like a fire department that hasn't run a drill in years. The equipment might technically still work, but response time and coordination degrade significantly without regular practice, even if no actual fire has occurred yet to reveal the problem. If you're already challenging your balance regularly through gardening, uneven terrain, or deliberate practice like standing on one leg, I want to encourage you to keep doing this consciously and consider adding slightly more variety, gentle stepping in different directions, or brief practice with your eyes closed while holding on to something solid for safety. If you've become more cautious in recent years and largely avoid uneven surfaces, I recommend beginning with supported single-leg stands near a countertop, 10 to 15 seconds per side, working gradually toward more challenging variations over several weeks. For synergy, pair balance practice with the floor sitting and rising practice from item 6, since stronger hip and leg muscles give your balance reflexes something powerful to actually execute once your brain senses you're off balance. Number 2, and this is the one I promised you at the very beginning. You still learn genuinely new things, rather than only revisiting familiar hobbies and routines. Walter, 77, from a farming community in Iowa, decided at 74 to learn to play the piano for the first time in his life, something he'd never attempted even as a child. He told me he felt a little ridiculous, starting from scratch at his age, fumbling through beginner exercises his great-granddaughter could outplay within weeks. But 3 years later, Walter still practices most days, and his cognitive assessments have remained remarkably stable compared to many of his peers. This is the habit I teased at the start of this video, and here's why researchers studying cognitive aging consider it so significant. Revisiting familiar hobbies, even engaging ones, tends to rely on well-established neural pathways your brain has used for decades, comfortable, efficient, but not particularly demanding of new growth. Genuinely novel learning, especially anything involving new physical coordination, new information, and sustained effortful practice, appears to stimulate something researchers call neuroplasticity, your brain's capacity to form new neural connections at any age, though the process requires more sustained effort than it did decades earlier. Here's the deeper reason this matters so specifically past 75. Cognitive reserve, a concept researchers use to describe your brain's built-up resilience against age-related decline and disease, appears to be built and maintained specifically through novel, challenging cognitive engagement, not through passive activities or even familiar, comfortable ones. Think of cognitive reserve like a financial reserve fund. You don't build savings by simply maintaining your current spending. You build it through deliberate, ongoing contribution. Similarly, your brain seems to build resilience specifically through the effort of learning something genuinely new, not through comfortable repetition of what you already know well. This is why I consider it so surprising and so significant when someone over 75 is still deliberately learning something new. A language, an instrument, a craft, a game, a skill entirely outside their existing wheelhouse. It requires a kind of intentional vulnerability, being a beginner again, that many people quietly avoid past a certain age, and yet it appears to offer some of the most robust cognitive protection available. If you're already engaged in learning something new, I want to encourage you to keep at it, even through the inevitable frustration of feeling like a beginner. If you've settled entirely into familiar routines, I gently suggest identifying one small, genuinely new skill this month, even something modest like learning 10 words in a new language or a new card game, and committing to 15 to 20 minutes of practice several times weekly. For synergy, pair new learning with adequate sleep on the days you practice, since research on skill acquisition and memory consolidation suggests that sleep plays a critical role in solidifying newly learned information and motor patterns, essentially filing away what you practice that day so it sticks rather than evaporating by tomorrow. And now, number 1. The single most remarkable habit on today's list, and the one that, in my clinical experience, most reliably separates thriving 80-year-olds from those who are simply getting by. You still get your heart rate up on purpose, doing something you genuinely enjoy, not just something you tolerate. Ruth, 72, wait, let me correct myself. Ruth is actually 79, from a small coastal town in Oregon, still goes ballroom dancing twice weekly with a local group, something she's done for over 30 years, and she told me she has no intention of stopping until my legs simply won't do it anymore. What struck me most in Ruth's case wasn't just that she exercises, plenty of seniors technically exercise, it's that she genuinely looks forward to it, describing the anticipation of Tuesday and Thursday evenings with real enthusiasm rather than a sense of dutiful obligation. Here's why this distinction matters enormously, and why I've placed it above every other item on today's list. Research on exercise adherence in older adults has consistently found that activities people genuinely enjoy are sustained far longer, often for years or even decades longer than activities undertaken purely out of obligation or fear, which tend to be abandoned within months once motivation inevitably wanes. And sustained cardiovascular activity that meaningfully raises your heart rate, appears to matter enormously for aging bodies, specifically because of its effects on your mitochondria. The tiny, energy-producing structures inside every cell in your body, think of mitochondria as the power generators inside a factory, and cardiovascular exercise as essentially sending in a maintenance crew to service and multiply those generators, keeping your entire cellular factory running efficiently rather than sputtering along on old, poorly maintained equipment. Research has found that regular cardiovascular activity in older adults is associated with improved mitochondrial density and efficiency, even when that activity begins later in life, along with meaningfully reduced markers of chronic inflammation, better blood sugar regulation, and improved blood flow to the brain itself. which appears to offer protective benefits against cognitive decline, separate from the purely physical benefits. Here's why joy specifically, not just activity, seems to matter so much after 75. Chronic stress and obligation-based effort elevate cortisol, a stress hormone that, over time, appears to work against some of the very adaptations you're trying to achieve through exercise, essentially fighting your own efforts at a cellular level. Activities that generate genuine enjoyment, by contrast, appear to support a more favorable hormonal environment for recovery and adaptation, meaning the same physical activity may produce measurably better results when it's something you love versus something you merely endure. If you already have a form of movement you genuinely love, whether it's dancing, gardening vigorously, swimming, or brisk walking with a friend, I want to encourage you to protect that activity fiercely and treat it as essential rather than optional, even on days when motivation dips. If you haven't found that activity yet, I'd encourage you to experiment across a few different options over the coming months, rather than forcing yourself into a single prescribed exercise you don't enjoy, since the research is clear that sustainability matters more than the specific activity chosen. For practical implementation, aim for a total of roughly 150 minutes weekly of activity that meaningfully raises your heart rate, broken into sessions of 20 to 30 minutes several times weekly, always adjusted to your individual health status and cleared with your physician, particularly if you have any cardiovascular conditions. For synergy, pair your enjoyable cardiovascular activity with adequate protein intake on the same days, since active recovery and adaptation, even from an activity you love, still requires the raw materials for muscle and tissue repair we discussed earlier in this video, tying this final habit back to the very first one we covered today. All of the research I've referenced throughout today's video, along with more detailed breakdowns of each specific practice, is linked in the description below. So you're welcome to look into the specifics yourself and discuss anything relevant here with your own physician before making changes to your routine. Before you go, I want you to really sit with something. If you recognized yourself in several of these 6 habits today, I want you to understand what that actually means. It doesn't mean you got lucky, and it doesn't mean you're simply exempt from the aging process everyone else experiences. It means, in all likelihood, that you've been quietly, consistently doing the harder thing, again and again, for years, often without any recognition or applause, and your body and your mind are showing the results of that accumulated effort right now. And if you didn't recognize yourself in all 6, I want you to hear this clearly. Every single one of these habits can be built starting today, regardless of your current age or your current starting point. Harold, Eleanor, Vincent, Dorothy, Walter, and Ruth didn't start these habits because they were unusually gifted or fundamentally different from anyone else their age. They started, and more importantly, they continued, day after day, year after year, because they understood something many people don't, that independence, vitality, and quality of life in your 70s and 80s aren't simply handed to you or withheld by fate. They are built and rebuilt continuously through the accumulated weight of small, deliberate choices. It is genuinely never too late to begin building them yourself, no matter what today's starting point looks like. If this video resonated with you, please subscribe to this channel. I make these because I believe every person in this remarkable decade of life deserves accurate, respectful information about what's truly possible for their body and mind, not vague assumptions about inevitable decline. And I want to know, down in the comments, which of these 6 things are you still doing, and which one are you determined to start now? I read every single comment, and I'll see you in the next video.